At the heart of Moscow's military communication center, where exhausted telegraph operators had spent months translating a flood of desperate battlefield messages since the German invasion in June 1941, one particular transmission stood out, not for its panic, but for its precision. Soviet procurement officers were drafting an official request to Great Britain, and it was not for rifles or ammunition or aircraft engines. It was for 3,000 tanks, specifically of the Valentine model, a vehicle considered outdated by many British generals who believed it had already been eclipsed by newer armored designs. Yet within days this request would evolve into the single largest Allied tank order of the entire war, a decision born not from blind desperation but from the cold calculus of necessity. By the winter of 1941, Stalin's armored forces were collapsing at a pace that defied understanding. Operation Barbarossa had torn across the Soviet Union like a storm ripping through wheat fields, scattering entire armies, shattering command structures, and leaving behind thousands of destroyed or abandoned tanks. But these machines were not only falling in combat. They were failing because Soviet industrial doctrine had long prioritized quantity over reliability. The Red Army entered the war with one of the largest tank forces in the world, yet by December 1941 more than 20,000 tanks had vanished from its order of battle, not simply from enemy fire, but from engines that froze solid, gearboxes that seized, and fuel supplies that evaporated in the chaos of retreat. T-26 light tanks, their petrol engines never designed for sub-zero temperatures, lined the roads leading eastward like metallic corpses. KV-1 heavy tanks, formidable on paper, were immobilized by mechanical failures that required factory-grade equipment to repair. The German Wehrmacht was closing on Moscow, and Soviet tank crews were learning an unforgiving truth: a tank that will not start is not a weapon, but a coffin on tracks. Lend-Lease aid from Britain and the United States was already trickling into the Soviet Union through dangerous Arctic convoys after the program had been formalized earlier that year. The Americans promised Shermans. The British offered Matildas and Valentines. Yet Soviet military observers in London had analyzed Allied tanks with far more seriousness than the British War Office suspected. They had watched British regiments maneuver through the bitter winter of 1940–41, had interviewed crews returning from the North African desert, and had noticed details the British themselves dismissed. Heavy, complex tanks spent days in repair depots, immobilized by design flaws or maintenance needs. But Valentine crews kept driving. The Soviet request that reached the British government stated not only the quantity but the urgency. 3,000 Valentines, delivered immediately, routed through Arctic convoys despite the horrifying risk of German submarines and aircraft. The British assumed the Soviets asked for Valentines simply because Britain had many and could spare them. But this was only partly true. Soviet engineers had studied the Valentine not as an obsolete infantry tank but as a masterpiece of simplicity, simplicity so deliberate it bordered on genius. Every engineer in the Soviet Union understood the theoretical superiority of diesel engines: reduced fire risk, better cold weather performance, improved fuel economy. Yet the Valentine used a petrol engine, an AEC or GMC depending on variant, and instead of rejecting this, the Soviets took note. The engine was accessible. The parts were simple. 3 men with basic tools could service it in under 2 hours. Its transmission was built from commercial automotive components, requiring no exotic materials or specialized machining. And most importantly, when something broke, and in war everything breaks, a tank crew could repair it in a frozen field without waiting for factory technicians. So the request for 3,000 Valentines was born not solely from desperation, though desperation certainly accelerated Soviet paperwork, but from a brutally rational calculation. The Red Army needed tanks that would start at -40°C, that crews could repair with their own hands, that would still be moving long after more advanced tanks had become frozen hulks. Britain happened to possess precisely such a machine. And the Soviets wanted them before winter deepened its grip around Moscow. The Valentine's origins were far humbler than the wartime mythology that would surround it. Vickers Armstrongs had submitted the design on Valentine's Day in 1938, a coincidence that gave the tank its deceptively romantic name, though its appearance and purpose were anything but sentimental. British tank doctrine of the 1930s divided armored vehicles into two rigid categories: heavily armored infantry tanks that advanced slowly with foot soldiers, and faster cruiser tanks intended for breakthrough and exploitation. The Valentine was officially an infantry tank, but Vickers engineers quietly broke the rules by basing its chassis on the earlier A-10 cruiser, resulting in a top speed of 24 kilometers per hour. Modest, but not glacial. Most importantly, they designed it around manufacturing realities rather than theoretical battlefield perfection. It used commercial automotive components. It avoided complex casting. It could be built quickly and cheaply. The War Office, obsessed with specifications and impressed by the heavily armored Matilda II already entering production, dismissed the Valentine at first. Why build an unremarkable infantry tank when Britain already had a heavily armored one? But war has a way of turning afterthoughts into necessities. When France collapsed in 1940 and Britain scrambled to rebuild its armored units, the Valentine design was hauled out of storage and approved not because generals reconsidered its merits, but because Britain needed a tank, any tank, that could be produced immediately. The Valentine's lack of glamour became its greatest strength. Factories across Britain and Canada retooled bus and lorry assembly lines to produce it. The hull used riveted construction, easy to manufacture. The turret was cramped but simple. The suspension used leaf springs rather than complex torsion bars. By mid-1941, Britain produced Valentines faster than any other tank. And this mattered more than its firepower or armor thickness. British crews complained about the cramped turret and the outdated 2-pounder gun. But they also admitted something that mattered more than comfort or firepower. The Valentine never stranded them. It started reliably. It ran consistently. And when it broke, they could fix it. The Soviets would soon discover these same qualities, under far more brutal conditions. The first Valentine shipments departed British ports in October 1941, lashed to decks of merchant ships braving the Arctic route to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Winter darkness shrouded these convoys for up to 20 hours a day. German U-boats lurked in the black waters. Luftwaffe bombers hunted from Norwegian airfields. Surface raiders stalked the shipping lanes invisible behind fog. Sailors knew that if they entered the freezing water, survival time was measured in minutes. Yet the convoys sailed, because Stalin needed tanks, and these frozen northern ports were the only ones not threatened by the German advance. Soviet dockworkers, laboring under bombardment and sub-zero temperatures, unloaded Valentines with astonishing efficiency. Within hours of arriving, the tanks were steaming toward the front on rail cars, their protective grease still melting under steam hoses. The numbers grew steadily. 87 Valentines arrived in January 1942. 112 in February. Over 200 per month by spring. Even catastrophic convoy losses, most famously PQ-17, where 24 merchant ships were sunk, did not halt deliveries. The human cost was immense. Merchant sailors died at rates comparable to frontline infantry. Yet despite German efforts, by the end of 1942 more than 2,000 Valentines had reached the Red Army, and these tanks were about to face the harshest proving ground on Earth. The winter of 1941-42 plunged the Eastern Front into temperatures so severe that steel shattered and lubricants turned solid. German Panzer crews lit fires beneath their hulls for hours each morning to warm engines and transmissions. Rubber seals cracked. Batteries died. Hydraulic recoil systems froze, turning tank guns into useless metal tubes. Tracks froze to the ground. Even the meticulously engineered German Maybach engines often refused to start. Against this backdrop of mechanical suffering, Valentine tanks performed with astonishing consistency. Soviet crews, at first skeptical of the small British imports, soon discovered that the Valentine's AEC petrol engine started more reliably in extreme cold than most Soviet or German engines. Its lubricants thickened, yes, but not enough to halt operation. Its gearbox tolerated semi-frozen oil. Its recoil system relied on springs rather than delicate hydraulics. And when conditions plunged below -40°C, Soviet crews simply drained the engine oil each night, warmed it by a fire, and poured it back in each morning, a 30-minute process compared to the hours Germans spent coaxing their engines to life. Reports from frontline units during the Moscow counteroffensive told a consistent story. In the worst cold, Valentines maintained higher operational readiness than T-34s, KV-1s, and every German tank they faced. 7 of 9 Valentines remained functional in one Guards regiment after a week of deep freeze conditions, while half the accompanying T-34s failed mechanically. The Valentine's reliability was not the result of brilliance or advanced design. It was the result of caution, of engineers who deliberately avoided unnecessary complexity in favor of ruggedness. Its splash lubrication system, mocked by some British designers as outdated, proved nearly indestructible. Its commercial-grade transmission parts were available in abundance. Its engine could be removed by a 3-man crew without special equipment. Soviet mechanics, used to struggling with the cramped interior of the T-34 and the monstrous weight of the KV-1's engine assemblies, began referring to the Valentine affectionately as the tank that wants to live. They meant it literally. When fuel lines froze or carburetors clogged, Valentine crews fixed the problem in the snow while other tanks were waiting for tow vehicles. Its electrical system used robust 24-volt wiring that could still deliver the necessary power even when batteries were drained by the cold. While German crews battled frozen starter motors and brittle wiring, Valentines simply started. Soviet tank commanders valued one trait above all: a machine that stayed alive long enough to complete its mission. And in 1942 and 1943, no Allied tank met that standard as consistently as the Valentine. Soviet tankers were not blind to the Valentine's shortcomings. Its 2-pounder gun lacked the penetrating power needed to fight newer German armor head-on. Its turret was cramped, forcing the commander to double as gunner. But these flaws mattered less in winter combat, where most engagements took place at short range because blowing snow limited visibility. And more importantly, a working small gun was infinitely better than a powerful gun that refused to fire because its recoil system had frozen. Many Soviet reports described German tanks immobilized by cold, unable to respond to attacks launched by reliable British vehicles already warmed and ready. Soviet modifications improved the Valentine further. They widened the tracks for snow, replaced British radios with Soviet models, and developed efficient winter camouflage. By early 1943, the Valentine had earned a reputation among crews as the most dependable winter tank on the Eastern Front. Deliveries continued through 1943 and into 1944, ultimately reaching 3,782 units, more than 43% of all Valentines ever built. No other British tank was ordered in such quantity. And the reason was clear. When tested under identical conditions, Valentines outperformed Matildas and Shermans in operational readiness, especially during winter. Sherman tanks had firepower, speed, and crew comfort, but their complex engines struggled in deep cold, and their size made them conspicuous targets. Matildas had thick armor but terrible mechanical reliability. The Valentine alone struck the balance the Soviets needed: adequate firepower, acceptable protection, and unrivaled reliability. During the battles of Stalingrad and later at Kursk, Valentines played crucial supporting roles, not as tank duelists, but as dependable workhorses that could be counted on to move, fire, and support infantry regardless of conditions. In the disastrous winter of 1942-43, where temperatures plummeted and German armor repeatedly failed to start in the mornings, Valentines continued operating, helping seal the encirclement of the German Sixth Army. At Kursk, they were used in secondary roles to protect flanks, attack lightly defended positions, and exploit gaps left by heavier Soviet tanks. Their performance was not glamorous, but it was essential. Even into 1944 and 1945, long after newer Soviet tanks had rendered the Valentine obsolete, some units retained them because they were so easy to maintain and so familiar to crews. They served as command tanks, recovery vehicles, and reconnaissance platforms in secondary sectors. A handful even reached Berlin. The Valentine's legacy was not defined by battlefield glory or technical innovation, but by proving a truth often forgotten in discussions of armored warfare: reliability is a weapon. A tank that starts every morning is deadlier than a tank that boasts perfect specifications but fails half the time. The Soviets internalized this lesson. Post-war designs like the T-54 emphasized maintainability, cold weather performance, and mechanical simplicity, a direct inheritance from the humble British tank that had kept fighting through the darkest winters of the war. Between 1941 and 1944, the Soviet Union received 3,782 Valentines. Many were destroyed in combat. Many more simply wore out. But during the critical years when the fate of the Eastern Front hung in the balance, these British machines, unglamorous, modest, often overlooked, kept starting, kept moving, and kept fighting. The Valentine earned its place in history not through brilliance, but through the stubborn, life-saving virtue of refusing to quit.